August 15, 1942, marked the beginning of what would become one of the Pacific War's most perplexing mysteries. Commander Takeo Kurita stood on the bridge of his destroyer, watching the dark waters of Blackett Strait with growing contempt. Intelligence reports had warned him about the American patrol torpedo boats, those insignificant plywood vessels the enemy called PT boats. As another squadron of these craft roared across the moonlit waves, their engines screaming like wounded animals, Kurita allowed himself a thin smile. The Imperial Japanese Navy had faced the combined might of battleships and carriers. These mosquito boats seemed hardly worth the ammunition. The PT boats had arrived in the Solomon Islands theater with grand promises. Built by Elko and Higgins in American shipyards, these 77-foot craft carried 4 torpedo tubes and bristled with machine guns. Their wooden hulls could slice through water at over 40 knots, making them theoretically perfect for hit-and-run attacks against the mighty Japanese fleet. Lieutenant Commander Alan Montgomery, tasked with coordinating PT boat operations from Tulagi, had watched dozens of these boats deploy into combat with high expectations. The Navy's propaganda machine had already dubbed them the cavalry of the seas, but Montgomery harbored private doubts that would soon prove prophetic. The first major engagement came on the night of August 20, 1942, when 8 PT boats intercepted a Japanese convoy near Vella La Vella. Engines roaring at full throttle, the boats charged toward their targets like knights in a medieval joust. Torpedo after torpedo leaped from their tubes, trailing phosphorescent wakes across the black water. The crews watched with held breath as their weapons streaked toward hulking enemy transports and destroyers. Then came the crushing anticlimax. Nothing happened. One torpedo passed directly beneath a transport's keel without detonating. Another struck a destroyer amidships with a metallic clang that echoed across the water, only to bounce off harmlessly and sink into the depths. Commander Kurita received reports of the attack the following morning. According to historical records maintained by the Naval History and Heritage Command, Japanese officers in the Southeast Area Fleet Headquarters actually laughed when reading the after-action reports. The Americans had fired 17 torpedoes in that single engagement. 0 hits, 0 damage. The PT boats had retreated under heavy fire, their heroic charge amounting to nothing more than wasted ordnance and fuel. Kurita ordered his staff to compile similar reports from other encounters. The pattern was unmistakable, and from the Japanese perspective, darkly amusing. Lieutenant Robert Reed commanded PT 109, one of the boats involved in the Vella La Vella fiasco. His after-action report dripped with frustration barely contained by military formality. The torpedoes had run true, the attacks executed according to doctrine, yet the Japanese ships had sailed on as if the PT boats didn't exist. Reed's crew had risked their lives charging into range of destroyers that could have blown them apart with a single salvo. For what? The humiliation of watching their torpedoes malfunction or miss became a bitter joke among the PT boat squadrons. They had charged into battle with wooden swords, expecting to fell giants, only to discover their weapons were toys. September 3, 1942 brought renewed urgency to the torpedo problem, though few in the Navy's upper echelons wanted to acknowledge it. Captain James Jimmy Fife, commander of submarines operating from Brisbane, Australia, had been filing increasingly angry reports about torpedo failures since the war's opening days. His submarine skippers reported the same maddening pattern: torpedoes running too deep, failing to detonate on contact, or suffering premature explosions that warned targets without inflicting damage. The Bureau of Ordnance in Washington dismissed these complaints with bureaucratic arrogance that would later seem criminal in its negligence. The Mark 13 torpedo, designed specifically for PT boats and aircraft, embodied everything wrong with pre-war American weapons development. Engineers at the Naval Torpedo Station in Newport, Rhode Island, had created a weapon based on peacetime assumptions and minimal testing. The torpedo's magnetic exploder, designated the Mark 6, was supposed to detonate beneath a ship's keel, breaking its back through hydrostatic pressure. In theory, this made it devastatingly effective. In practice, the magnetic exploder was so sensitive to Earth's magnetic field variations that it rarely worked as intended. The Pacific's magnetic environment differed significantly from the Atlantic waters, where limited testing had occurred. Lieutenant Howard Shorty Bowers experienced the torpedo problem's deadly consequences firsthand, on September 11, 1942. His PT boat, 137, had stalked a Japanese cruiser for over an hour, maneuvering into perfect attack position despite heavy seas. At 800 yards, point-blank range for a torpedo attack, Bowers gave the order to fire. All 4 torpedoes leaped from their tubes. The first torpedo's warhead exploded prematurely, just 200 yards from launch, nearly swamping the PT boat with its blast. The second torpedo's engine failed, sending it spiraling uselessly into the depths. The third torpedo porpoised, breaking the surface repeatedly, before diving deep and passing far beneath the cruiser. Only the fourth torpedo ran true, striking the cruiser's hull with a satisfying clang that brought cheers from Bowers' crew. The cheers died when nothing happened. The warhead had failed to detonate. The Japanese cruiser's response was swift and merciless. Searchlights snapped on, pinning PT-137 like a moth on a board. 5-inch guns thundered, hurling shells that threw up enormous waterspouts around the fleeing PT boat. Bowers threw the helm hard over, engines screaming at maximum power, and somehow escaped into the darkness. 2 of his crewmen had been wounded by shell fragments. His boat had burned through precious fuel for nothing. The Japanese cruiser sailed on, probably unaware how close it had come to actual danger. Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet, finally ordered a comprehensive investigation in October 1942. The findings, compiled by teams of engineers and combat officers, revealed a scandal that reached into the highest levels of naval procurement. The Mark 13 torpedo had never been adequately tested under combat conditions. Its magnetic exploder was fundamentally flawed. Its depth-keeping mechanism was unreliable. Its contact exploder, designed as a backup, was too fragile and often shattered on impact without triggering detonation. Essentially, the Navy had sent men into battle with weapons that didn't work, then blamed those men when the weapons failed. The Japanese, meanwhile, continued monitoring PT boat activities with a mixture of contempt and curiosity. Vice Admiral Junichi Kusaka, commanding Southeast Area Fleet Operations, noted in his diary that American torpedo boats had now fired over 100 torpedoes with virtually nothing to show for it. His staff officers joked about the American fireworks displays that preceded each PT boat retreat. The psychological impact on American crews was devastating, eroding confidence in their weapons and their mission at a time when the Pacific War's outcome remained desperately uncertain. November 7, 1942, dawned gray and oppressive over Guadalcanal, where the ground campaign had devolved into a brutal stalemate. PT boat squadrons operating from Tulagi found themselves thrust into roles never envisioned by their designers. With torpedoes proving unreliable, squadron commanders began emphasizing the boat's machine guns and small cannons. Lieutenant Commander Robert Kelly, who had evacuated General Douglas MacArthur from the Philippines in PT-41, now found himself leading attacks where PT boats served primarily as floating gun platforms, harassing Japanese supply convoys with automatic weapons fire. The Tokyo Express, Allied forces' sardonic nickname for Japanese high-speed reinforcement runs down the slot, presented both opportunity and frustration for PT boat crews. Japanese destroyers and fast cruisers would race south under cover of darkness, delivering troops and supplies to Guadalcanal before dawn, forced them to retreat beyond American air power's reach. These vessels moved at 35 knots or faster, making them extremely difficult targets even if the torpedoes had worked properly. PT boats would intercept these runs, their commanders knowing that torpedo attacks would likely prove futile, but feeling compelled to try anyway. On the night of November 13, 1942, PT boats participated in one of the war's most chaotic naval battles. The Naval Battle of Guadalcanal saw American and Japanese surface forces clashing at point-blank range in Iron Bottom Sound. 8 PT boats, including Lieutenant Reed's 109, found themselves caught in the middle of a battleship and cruiser slugfest. Reed later described the scene as something from Dante's Inferno. Ships exploding, tracers crisscrossing the sky in every direction, the water illuminated by burning vessels and star shells. His boat fired all 4 torpedoes at targets of opportunity. He never knew if any hit, and suspected none did. The battle's confusion made accurate damage assessment impossible, but post-war Japanese records revealed no torpedo damage to major vessels during that engagement. The psychological toll on PT boat crews became increasingly evident. Ensign John Searles, assigned to PT 59, wrote letters home that captured the growing despair. He described the sick feeling in his stomach when ordered to make torpedo runs, knowing the odds of success approached zero. His boat had fired 16 torpedoes in combat, 16 failures. Searles wrote about watching torpedoes pass directly under enemy ships without exploding or striking hulls with audible clangs before sinking, their warheads inert. He questioned whether he and his crew were cowards for feeling relieved when torpedo attacks failed, sparing them the extended gun duels that invariably followed when they pressed attacks home. The Bureau of Ordnance finally authorized field modifications in December 1942. PT boat tenders at Tulagi began deactivating the troublesome magnetic exploders, relying solely on contact detonators. Engineers adjusted depth settings, trying to compensate for the torpedo's tendency to run deeper than intended. These modifications helped, but they couldn't fix fundamental design flaws. The contact exploder's fragility remained. Torpedoes still ran erratically. The improvements were marginal at best, raising the success rate from abysmal to merely terrible. Commander Montgomery calculated that PT boats were now achieving roughly a 5% hit rate, one functioning hit for every 20 torpedoes fired. By naval standards, this represented catastrophic failure. Japanese commanders noted the slight improvement in PT boat effectiveness, but their fundamental contempt remained unchanged. Captain Tamechi Hara, commanding the destroyer Shigure, wrote in his memoirs about PT boat attacks during this period. He described them as nuisance raids that rarely threatened properly handled warships. His destroyer had been attacked by PT boats on 4 separate occasions. Not once had a torpedo come close to hitting. Hara's greatest concern during these attacks was not the torpedoes, but the possibility of collision with a PT boat in the darkness, a humiliating way to damage his vessel. January 23, 1943 brought bitter cold to the Solomon Islands as tropical storms lashed the combat zones. Lieutenant Commander John Bulkley, who had earned the Medal of Honor for evacuating MacArthur and become the PT boat force's most celebrated hero, returned to the Pacific Theater to inspect operational conditions. What he found shocked him. The boats he had championed were being squandered in missions they couldn't accomplish, commanded by increasingly demoralized officers, maintained by crews who had lost faith in their weapons. Bulkley's report to Admiral William Halsey pulled no punches. The PT boat program was failing, and men were dying for nothing. The casualty statistics told a grim story that official propaganda worked hard to obscure. By early 1943, PT boat squadrons in the South Pacific had suffered over 40% casualties, killed, wounded, or missing, with virtually nothing to show for it in terms of confirmed ship sinkings. PT 112 had been blown apart by destroyer gunfire after a failed torpedo attack, killing all 12 crewmen. PT 44 had struck a reef while retreating from a Japanese cruiser, its crew captured and later executed. PT 37 had been cut in half by a destroyer during a daylight encounter forced by a pursuit following yet another botched night attack. The survivors could count on one hand the confirmed enemy vessels they had actually sunk with torpedoes. The Japanese maintained meticulous records of every engagement, and these records, captured after the war, revealed the full scope of the torpedo failure. Through February 1943, American PT boats had fired approximately 450 torpedoes in the Solomon Islands campaign. Japanese damage reports documented 7 confirmed hits that caused significant damage. 7 hits from 450 torpedoes yielded a hit rate of 1.6%. Naval artillery pieces of the era achieved hit rates of 20 to 30% under similar conditions. The PT boat's primary weapon was effectively useless. Lieutenant Hank Brantingham commanded PT 159 during a mission that exemplified the hopeless frustration of this period. Intelligence had identified a Japanese convoy moving through Kula Gulf, 3 transports escorted by 2 destroyers. Brantingham led a division of 4 PT boats in a carefully coordinated attack on the night of February 11, 1943. The boats approached from different angles, achieving surprise, and launched a total of 16 torpedoes at ranges between 600 and 1,000 yards. These were textbook attacks executed under near-ideal conditions. The results were predictably devastating for American morale. 3 torpedoes exploded prematurely. 2 porpoised and broached. 4 ran beneath their targets without detonating. 7 simply disappeared, their fates unknown. 0 hits, 0 damage. The destroyers counterattacked, sinking PT-163 and damaging Brantingham's boat so severely it barely made it back to base. The Navy's response to mounting criticism was to double down on training and tactics, as if the problem lay with the men rather than the machines. Additional PT boat squadrons deployed to the Pacific received intensive training in night torpedo attacks. Doctrine manuals were revised and updated. Senior officers gave inspiring speeches about determination and courage. None of this addressed the fundamental issue. The torpedoes didn't work. Lieutenant Commander Montgomery, now thoroughly disillusioned, began advocating for converting PT boats into pure gunboats, arguing that their torpedo capability was worse than useless because it encouraged attacks that got crews killed without accomplishing anything meaningful. By March 1943, the torpedo count had exceeded 600, and Japanese naval officers were openly mocking American PT boats in their communications. Admiral Kusaka issued a directive stating that PT boats should be considered primarily as reconnaissance threats and targets of opportunity, not as serious combat vessels requiring major tactical consideration. This was perhaps the most damning assessment of all. The enemy had concluded that PT boats, despite their speed and aggressive tactics, posed negligible danger to properly defended warships. The Americans' much-vaunted cavalry of the seas had become a joke in the Japanese fleet. August 2, 1943 would etch itself into history for reasons having nothing to do with torpedo effectiveness. Lieutenant Junior Grade John Fitzgerald Kennedy, commanding PT-109, was patrolling Blackett Strait with his crew of 12 when the Japanese destroyer Amagiri materialized from the darkness. What happened next would be debated for decades, analyzed by historians, and shaped by political considerations. But the basic facts were undeniable and deeply embarrassing for the PT boat program. The Amagiri, under Commander Kohei Hanami's command, was part of a Tokyo Express run delivering supplies and troops to Vila on Kolombangara Island. Hanami's destroyer was making 30 knots when lookouts spotted PT-109 at approximately 200 yards. Kennedy's boat was idling on one engine to reduce noise and wake visibility, a common tactic during night patrols. What should have been a textbook torpedo boat ambush instead became a disaster. Kennedy apparently never saw the destroyer until it was nearly on top of his boat. He gunned his engines trying to turn into attack position, but the laws of physics and momentum were unforgiving. The Amagiri struck PT-109 amidships, nearly cutting the plywood boat in half. The collision was catastrophic. The impact killed 2 of Kennedy's crew instantly, Andrew Jackson Kirksey and Harold Marney, torn apart by the destroyer's bow or pulled into her churning propellers. The PT boat's fuel tanks ruptured, spilling gasoline that ignited in a fireball visible for miles. Kennedy and the 10 surviving crew members found themselves in the water, surrounded by burning fuel. The Amagiri, suffering only minor damage to her hull, continued on her mission without stopping to confirm the PT boat's destruction, a decision Commander Hanami would later regret when Kennedy's survival and heroic rescue of his crew became international news. Kennedy's subsequent ordeal, swimming 3 miles to Plum Pudding Island while towing badly burned crew member Patrick McMahon by a life jacket strap clenched between his teeth, then island hopping to find rescue, would make him a war hero and eventually contribute to his path to the presidency. But the incident that created this heroism was, from a tactical perspective, a complete failure. PT-109 never fired a single torpedo, never engaged the enemy offensively. The boat was destroyed not through heroic sacrifice, but through what appeared to be a combination of tactical errors and simple bad luck. That an enemy destroyer could approach and strike a PT boat without the PT boat even attempting to fight back raised uncomfortable questions about the boat's effectiveness as combat vessels. The Japanese viewed the Kennedy incident with bemused contempt. Commander Hanami's report described the collision as unremarkable. His destroyer had simply run down an American patrol boat that failed to detect his approach despite calm seas and good visibility. No evasive maneuvers had been necessary. No torpedoes had been fired at his ship. The Amagiri had sustained superficial damage requiring minor repairs. From the Japanese perspective, this was just another example of PT boats' operational inadequacy. The boats were fast when running, but apparently helpless when trying to actually attack prepared enemies. The American public, of course, heard a very different story. Kennedy's heroism in saving his crew was absolutely genuine and worthy of celebration. But the Navy's public relations apparatus carefully omitted the embarrassing context that PT-109 had been destroyed without firing a shot, that Kennedy had apparently failed to detect a destroyer in waters he was patrolling, that the cavalry of the seas had been ridden down by the very prey it was supposed to hunt. The propaganda value of Kennedy's survival and rescue of his men was too valuable to complicate with operational realities. By August 1943, the torpedo count had surpassed 700. 700 torpedoes fired in combat by PT boats in the Solomon Islands campaign. The confirmed sinking tally remained in single digits. Japanese naval records documented fewer than a dozen incidents where PT boat torpedoes had caused even moderate damage to warships or transports. The laugh that began with Commander Kurita in August 1942 had spread throughout the Japanese fleet. American patrol torpedo boats had fired 700 torpedoes and accomplished almost nothing. It was, from the Japanese perspective, simultaneously baffling and hilarious. A monument to American industrial capacity wasted on a weapon system that simply didn't work. September 15, 1943 marked a turning point when Admiral Halsey convened a conference at Noumea to address the PT boat problem directly. The meeting included PT squadron commanders, ordnance experts, and operational analysts who had studied every torpedo attack since the campaign's beginning. The atmosphere was tense. Junior officers feared retribution for speaking honestly about the failures they had witnessed. Senior officers feared their careers would be damaged by association with one of the war's most visible disasters. But Halsey, to his credit, demanded truth regardless of consequences. Commander Montgomery presented the statistical analysis his staff had compiled. The numbers were devastating. PT boats had now fired 743 torpedoes in combat. They could confirm 18 hits that caused significant damage, a 2.4% success rate. Of those 18 hits, only 6 had resulted in ships actually sinking. The kill ratio, torpedoes fired to ships sunk, stood at 124-1. By comparison, American submarines, using the same flawed Mark 13 torpedo family, were achieving kill ratios of approximately 15-1. Even accounting for submarines' larger torpedo capacity and better firing solutions, the disparity was inexplicable unless PT boat tactics were fundamentally flawed, or the smaller torpedo variant had additional problems. Lieutenant Reed, now promoted to lieutenant commander after surviving a year of combat, offered a frontline perspective that challenged comfortable assumptions. He argued that PT boat doctrine, developed in peacetime exercises against cooperative targets, had proven completely inadequate for real combat. The boats were too loud to achieve surprise against alert enemies. Their wooden hulls made them fragile in combat. Their small size limited the number of torpedoes they could carry, forcing crews to make every shot count with weapons that rarely worked. Most damningly, Reed argued that successful torpedo attacks required approaching within 800 yards of targets, a range at which enemy destroyers' guns could annihilate PT boats with ease. The conference participants examined captured Japanese after-action reports that had fallen into American hands during recent operations. These documents provided the enemy's perspective on PT boat attacks, and that perspective was brutally unflattering. Japanese commanders described PT boats as nuisance weapons that occasionally disrupted operations through their sheer persistence, but rarely inflicted serious damage. One report from Vice Admiral Kusaka's staff noted that PT boat attacks had become so predictable that standard defensive procedures, searchlights, suppressive fire, and aggressive maneuvering almost invariably negated them. The report concluded that the primary value of PT boats was in reconnaissance and harassment, not as legitimate threats to capital ships or well-defended convoys. The torpedo manufacturers, represented by engineers from the Naval Torpedo Station in Newport, mounted a defensive presentation that rang increasingly hollow as the conference progressed. They acknowledged design flaws in the Mark 13, but insisted that recent modifications had addressed the worst problems. They presented test firing data showing improved reliability. They argued that field conditions, rough seas, poor maintenance, operator error, contributed significantly to combat failures. The submarine officers present erupted in anger at this attempted deflection. If submariners could achieve reasonable success rates with the same basic torpedo design, the problem clearly lay specifically with either the PT boat variant or PT boat tactics, not with crew competence. Admiral Halsey made his decision based on hard mathematics and harder truths. PT boats would continue operating in the South Pacific, but their mission would fundamentally change. Torpedo attacks would no longer be the primary focus. Instead, PT boats would concentrate on anti-barge operations, coast watching, and supporting ground operations, roles that emphasized their guns and speed rather than their torpedoes. This wasn't surrender, it was recognition that continuing to throw PT boat crews into missions optimized for weapons that didn't work constituted criminal negligence. The boats could be valuable assets if employed properly. They had proven nearly worthless in their designed role. The Japanese response to this tactical shift was telling. When PT boat torpedo attacks declined dramatically in October and November 1943, Japanese naval intelligence actually investigated whether the Americans had withdrawn the boats from combat. The idea that PT boats might simply stop trying to use their primary weapon apparently struck Japanese analysts as so unlikely they initially dismissed reports from field commanders. When the pattern held, Admiral Kusaka's staff concluded that either the Americans had finally run out of torpedoes or had finally recognized what Japanese commanders had known since August 1942. PT boat torpedoes were, for practical purposes, useless. January 8, 1944 saw the first combat deployment of heavily modified PT boats, incorporating lessons learned from the torpedo debacle. These new configurations mounted additional 40mm cannons, rocket launchers, and in some cases even 37mm automatic cannons stripped from Army anti-aircraft units. The torpedo tubes remained, but they were now clearly secondary weapons. PT boats were being transformed into fast attack gunboats, and in this role they would finally prove their worth. The barge hunting missions that became PT boats' primary role played to their actual strengths. Japanese supply lines in the New Guinea and Solomon Islands campaigns increasingly relied on powered barges, essentially armored landing craft, that could navigate shallow coastal waters inaccessible to larger vessels. These barges moved at night, hugging coastlines, carrying troops and supplies to isolated garrisons. They were soft targets compared to destroyers and cruisers, but they were absolutely critical to Japanese logistics. And unlike destroyers, barges couldn't outrun PT boats or bring overwhelming firepower to bear. Lieutenant John Duke Coley commanded PT-191 during a mission that exemplified the new PT boat doctrine. On the night of February 3, 1944, his division of 4 PT boats intercepted a convoy of 7 Japanese barges off the coast of New Britain. The PT boats attacked in a coordinated sweep, machine guns and cannons blazing. Unlike torpedo attacks that required precise positioning and often resulted in frustrating misses, gun attacks were immediate and devastating. Tracers ripped into the barge's wooden hulls. Explosive rounds detonated ammunition and fuel. Within 15 minutes, all 7 barges were either sinking or burning. The PT boats suffered minor damage from return fire, but no casualties. Coley's after-action report dripped with vindication. Finally, after months of futility, PT boats had found a mission where they excelled. The psychological impact on PT boat crews was transformative. Ensign Robert Ballantyne, who had survived the dark days of 1942 and early 1943, wrote home describing the difference between the old and new missions. Torpedo attacks had been exercises in frustration and terror, long approaches under enemy fire, weapon failures, and desperate retreats. Barge hunting was visceral and immediate. You saw your targets. You saw your rounds hitting. You saw results. The transformation from impotent fury to effective violence restored morale that had been shattered by the torpedo failures. The Japanese response to this tactical evolution was grudging respect. Commander Hara, whose destroyer Shigur had disdainfully brushed off PT boat torpedo attacks, noted in his memoirs that PT boat gun attacks on supply barges had become genuinely problematic. The barges couldn't outrun the PT boats, couldn't effectively fight back against their firepower, and were vulnerable to the very attributes that made PT boats poor torpedo boats: their speed and maneuverability. Japanese supply officers began routing barges only on moonless nights and organizing them into larger convoys with destroyer escorts, measures that significantly complicated logistics operations. By mid-1944, PT boats were destroying more Japanese vessels per month than they had in the entire previous year of torpedo operations, and they were doing it with far fewer casualties. The boats that had fired over 700 torpedoes with minimal results were now sinking dozens of barges and small craft monthly using guns and rockets. The transformation was so complete that new PT boat designs eliminated one or more torpedo tubes to accommodate additional gun mounts. The cavalry of the seas had become floating gun platforms, and in that role, they were finally living up to their promise. The torpedo count eventually stabilized at approximately 800 total torpedoes, fired by PT boats in the South Pacific campaign through 1943. The final tally showed fewer than 30 confirmed instances of significant damage from those 800 torpedoes, with perhaps a dozen enemy vessels actually sunk. It was, by any measure, one of the war's great weapon failures. But unlike some military disasters that destroyed the units involved, the PT boat force survived by adapting. By abandoning the mission it was designed for and embracing roles it could actually accomplish, the PT boat program salvaged value from catastrophic failure.
June 6, 1944, D-Day in Europe, found PT boats operating in the Philippines as General MacArthur's island-hopping campaign accelerated. The boats that supported landings at Leyte and Mindoro bore little resemblance to the torpedo boats that had frustrated their crews 2 years earlier. These were purpose-built gunboats, their torpedo tubes often removed entirely to make room for additional weaponry. They served as mobile artillery platforms, fire support for beach assaults, and anti-suicide boat defense, a new threat as Japanese tactics grew increasingly desperate.
The institutional lessons from the torpedo failure permeated American naval thinking. The Bureau of Ordnance underwent complete reorganization after investigations revealed the extent to which bureaucratic arrogance and refusal to acknowledge field reports had perpetuated the Mark 13 fiasco. Admiral King personally cashiered several senior ordnance officers whose careers had been built on the torpedo program. The new leadership implemented rigorous testing protocols and, crucially, created feedback channels that allowed operational commanders to report weapon failures without fear of being blamed for the failures they reported. Commander Montgomery, promoted to captain and assigned to Washington to help implement these reforms, later wrote a classified report that became required reading at the Naval War College. His analysis dissected how the torpedo failure had occurred not through single catastrophic errors, but through cascading institutional failures. Insufficient testing. Dismissal of negative reports. Assumption that peacetime doctrine would translate to combat conditions. Unwillingness to admit mistakes until casualties and failures became undeniable. Montgomery's report concluded that the 700-plus torpedoes fired by PT boats represented not just mechanical failure, but organizational failure at the highest levels of naval procurement and doctrine development. The Japanese perspective on the PT boat saga crystallized in post-war interrogations of surviving Japanese naval officers. Admiral Kusaka, when questioned about American torpedo boat effectiveness, stated bluntly that Japanese commanders had been baffled by American persistence in using weapons that obviously didn't work. He estimated that if PT boat torpedoes had functioned with even submarine-level reliability, the Tokyo Express runs would have suffered significantly higher casualties, potentially altering the Guadalcanal campaign's timeline. Instead, the torpedo failures had essentially neutered one of America's few naval assets that could operate effectively in confined coastal waters, where Japanese surface supremacy had been most pronounced. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, who had smiled at early reports of PT boat failures, was captured after the war and provided extensive interviews to American naval historians. He acknowledged that Japanese contempt for PT boats had been so complete that standard defensive procedures were often not followed during 1942 and early 1943. Japanese commanders simply didn't believe PT boats could seriously threaten their vessels, an assessment the torpedo failure rate had repeatedly validated. Kurita noted that when PT boats transitioned to gun-based attacks on supply vessels, Japanese tactical assessments had to be completely revised. The boats that had been dismissed as ineffective nuisances became genuine threats requiring substantial defensive resources. The financial cost of the torpedo failure was staggering even by wartime standards. Each Mark 13 torpedo cost approximately $10,000 in 1943 dollars, roughly $200,000 in current value. 800 torpedoes represented $8 million in direct weapon costs, plus the operational costs of the missions that fired them, plus the replacement costs for PT boats lost in failed attacks. This didn't account for the incalculable cost of crew casualties, damaged morale, and delayed operational effectiveness. For a weapon system that sank perhaps a dozen enemy vessels total, the cost-benefit analysis was catastrophic. The human cost was worse. At least 200 American sailors died in PT boat operations during the period when torpedo attacks remained the primary mission. While not all these deaths resulted directly from torpedo failures, the failure rate undeniably extended PT boats' vulnerability periods during attacks, forcing longer exposures to enemy fire, while crews tried to achieve hits with unreliable weapons. Every failed torpedo attack that forced a second or third approach increased the probability of casualties. The crews who survived remembered the sick feeling of watching torpedoes malfunction while enemy gunfire walked closer, knowing they would have to try again or retreat in failure. March 27, 1945, brought unexpected closure to the PT boat torpedo saga. Admiral Kurita, now commanding the remnants of Japanese naval forces in the home islands, composed a staff assessment of American naval capabilities that would be captured when Japan surrendered 5 months later. In this document, Kurita reflected on the Pacific War's naval campaigns, including his observations about American PT boats. His commentary, translated and declassified decades later, provided the final perspective on one of the war's strangest chapters. Kurita wrote that PT boat torpedo failures had represented both a significant Japanese advantage and a lost American opportunity. He calculated that if American torpedoes had functioned properly during 1942 and 1943, Japanese losses in destroyers and transports during the Guadalcanal and New Guinea campaigns would have been substantially higher. The Tokyo Express runs that kept Japanese garrisons supplied had operated with minimal concern for PT boat attacks, specifically because those attacks had proven so ineffective. Kurita noted that a single American torpedo boat operating with reliable weapons in confined waters at night could theoretically threaten even capital ships, fast, maneuverable, difficult to target, and capable of withdrawing before effective counterattacks could be organized. The Admiral's assessment acknowledged what American commanders had also concluded, that PT boats' transition to gunboat roles had been operationally sound, but represented a fundamental admission of the torpedo program's failure. Kurita observed that Japanese supply operations, already strained by submarine interdiction and air attacks, had been further complicated when PT boats began effectively hunting supply barges. He suggested, with the bitter wisdom of a defeated commander, that if Americans had deployed effective gunboat PT boats from the war's beginning, rather than persisting with defective torpedoes for over a year, Japanese positions in the Solomons and New Guinea might have become untenable months earlier than they did. The final accounting of PT boat torpedo effectiveness made for grim reading in post-war assessments. Through the entire Pacific War, PT boats fired approximately 1,200 torpedoes in combat across all theaters. Confirmed kills attributed to PT boat torpedoes numbered fewer than 30 vessels total, and many of those attributions were questionable, based on inconclusive evidence from night actions where multiple Allied forces were engaging the same targets. The South Pacific Campaign, where over 700 torpedoes had been fired, accounted for the majority of these failures and the smallest proportion of successes. Lieutenant Commander Reed, who survived the war and later became a respected naval historian, spent decades researching the PT boat torpedo failure. His definitive study, published in 1968, laid bare the institutional failures that had caused the disaster. Reed documented how the Bureau of Ordnance had ignored or suppressed negative reports from both submarine and PT boat commanders throughout 1942. He revealed that successful torpedo designs used by British and German forces had been studied but not adopted due to not invented here attitudes among American designers. Most damningly, Reed showed that the Mark 13's fundamental flaws were known to engineers before the war, But that production pressures and bureaucratic momentum had prevented needed redesigns. The human story behind the numbers emerged through interviews Reed conducted with surviving PT boat veterans. These men described the corrosive effect of weapon failures on combat effectiveness and morale. They spoke about the black humor that developed, jokes about baptizing torpedoes instead of firing them, since the weapons seemed to do nothing but get wet. They remembered the rage and helplessness of watching torpedoes malfunction, while Japanese ships that should have been sinking steamed away untouched. Some admitted they had eventually become glad when torpedo attacks failed, because success would have required pressing attacks that exposed them to extended enemy fire. The Japanese perspective, preserved in post-war writings by officers like Commander Hara and Admiral Kusaka, treated the American torpedo failure as a cautionary tale about overconfidence in technology and institutional resistance to acknowledging problems. Japanese naval doctrine emphasized weapon reliability and extensive testing, though Japan had its own weapon failures during the war. The tone in Japanese accounts shifted from the contemptuous amusement of early war reports to something approaching sympathy in later reflections. Professional naval officers, regardless of nationality, understood the betrayal combat personnel felt when their weapons failed them. The legacy of those 700-plus torpedoes fired in the South Pacific campaign extended far beyond the immediate tactical failures. The scandal prompted fundamental reforms in how the United States Navy developed, tested, and deployed weapon systems. The Mark 13 torpedo, eventually fixed through field modifications and extensive redesign, became a cautionary example studied by every subsequent generation of naval officers. The Bureau of Ordnance's institutional arrogance, which had dismissed frontline reports as user error rather than design failure, was broken and replaced with systems that prioritized operational feedback. John F. Kennedy's presidency brought renewed attention to PT boat operations, though Kennedy himself rarely discussed the circumstances of PT 109's loss. When he did address his wartime service, he focused on the rescue of his crew rather than the tactical situation that made rescue necessary. The broader context, that his boat had been destroyed without firing a shot, part of a campaign where hundreds of torpedoes had accomplished almost nothing, remained diplomatically obscured. Kennedy understood, as did other PT boat veterans, that the heroism of individual sailors and the systemic failure of their weapons were separate truths that could coexist. The PT boat program's redemption through adaptation to gunboat roles provided a different kind of lesson. Military organizations that can recognize failure, abandon failing doctrines, and rapidly adapt to circumstances have historically outperformed those that rigidly adhere to plans regardless of results. PT boats in their final configuration, fast gunboats rather than torpedo boats, proved genuinely valuable in the Pacific War's later stages. They supported amphibious operations, hunted enemy supply craft, and provided coastal patrol capabilities that larger vessels couldn't match. The boats succeeded by becoming something other than what they were designed to be. Commander Montgomery's post-war career included testimony before Congress about military procurement reform. He argued passionately that the Mark 13 failure represented not just technical problems, but a moral failure to support the men ordered to use defective weapons. Montgomery's testimony helped establish oversight mechanisms requiring independent testing of weapon systems before full-scale deployment. These reforms couldn't prevent all future weapon failures. Military history continued to be littered with them, but they created institutional pressure toward acknowledging and addressing problems rather than denying them. The 800 torpedoes fired by PT boats in the South Pacific, and the 400 fired in other theaters, became a numerical shorthand for systemic failure in military circles. Another PT boat torpedo became sardonic military slang for any weapon system that looked impressive in specifications but failed in actual use. The phrase appeared in classified assessments of troubled weapons programs for decades, a ghostly reminder that technological sophistication means nothing if the technology doesn't work under combat conditions. The Japanese officers who had laughed at PT boat torpedo failures in 1942 and 1943 stopped laughing as the war progressed, and their own weapons failures became apparent. Japanese long-lance torpedoes, initially far superior to American designs, suffered from depleted oxygen supplies and maintenance problems that reduced effectiveness. Japanese aircraft, magnificent in 1941, became obsolete as American designs evolved, while Japanese industry couldn't match the pace of improvement. The admirals who had mocked American PT boats found themselves commanding fleets increasingly outmatched in every category. Victory provides tolerance for laughing at enemy failures. Defeat renders such laughter hollow. The final word perhaps belonged to the PT boat crews themselves, the men who had charged into combat with weapons that betrayed them. In reunions held decades after the war, these veterans spoke with remarkable clarity about what the torpedo failure had meant. They had not lost faith in their country or their mission. They had lost faith in the bureaucrats and engineers who sent them to war with defective tools. The distinction mattered. The crew's courage had never been in question. Their weapons' reliability had been non-existent. Future generations of sailors would benefit from reforms purchased with the blood and frustration of PT boat crews who fired 700 torpedoes and watched most of them fail. The admirals had laughed when PT boats fired 700 torpedoes and accomplished almost nothing. History's verdict was less amused. The torpedo failure represented everything wrong with military bureaucracy: arrogance, resistance to negative feedback, prioritization of institutional reputation over operational effectiveness, and willingness to sacrifice frontline personnel rather than admit mistakes. The laughter died in the smoke of sunken PT boats and the statistical columns that documented undeniable failure. What remained was a lesson written in salt water and blood. Weapons that don't work kill the people forced to use them, and no amount of courage can compensate for institutional incompetence. The 800 torpedoes became a memorial of sorts, not to victory or heroism in the conventional sense, but to the harder lessons of warfare. They testified to the resilience of young men ordered into impossible situations with inadequate tools. They documented the cost of bureaucratic failure measured in wasted resources and wasted lives. They proved that even devastating systemic failures could be overcome through adaptation and honest assessment. And they served as permanent warning that the enemy's laughter at your failures is far less dangerous than your own refusal to acknowledge them. In the end, the PT boats found their purpose, the torpedoes were eventually fixed, and the war was won. But the 700 torpedoes fired in the South Pacific Campaign remained a cautionary tale that echoed through the decades, a reminder that in war, as in life, having impressive weapons matters far less than having weapons that actually work when you need them most. The Japanese admirals had laughed, and their laughter had been entirely justified. The tragedy was that it had taken so long and cost so much for the Americans to understand why.